All right. All right, let's hit it. Hello, welcome to Spring Boot Learning, the channel where we learn about Spring Boot and have fun doing it. My name is Greg Turnquist. I'm Principal Spring Developer, and tonight on this live coding stream, on this live coding session, call it what you will, we are going to be discussing DTOs versus entities. And we're starting right now. Hear that? Oh, I love that sound. Okay, let's take that back a little. All right. So we've done some live coding sessions in the past. I believe it was a couple weeks ago we did 2 nights back to back. We talked about Spring Web, Spring Data, and I wanted to talk about an issue I've seen pop up. Somebody's asked it to me on the before, I think through the comments. I've seen it show up on Stack Overflow, and it's something I think there could be a bit of confusion about. So let's go talk about it. On some of my live coding demos, if I flip over here, where I've got some code up here, you can go take a look here. Right here, you can see I've got, let me scroll up where you can see the top of this class here. If I can find the mouse. So I've been doing demos. I've created APIs where I have to return back employee objects. I have a first name, a last name, a role. I've used it. It's a great way to demonstrate building web controllers, or a way to show, how to write queries, how to derive stuff, how to grab the power of Spring and show you how to get quickly to solving the business problem that you're trying to do. But something that kind of slips past that is this absolutely the best way to build your application? Because what you'll notice is this employee object that I use, if you flip over to the controller that we're doing, well, here in this example, we're fetching the data and we're putting it into a template. But in this kind of controller, but if I flip over here to an API controller, what are we doing? These are some various search ones. But here, this aggregate, the search query, I have some leftover stuff from previous codings, but if I quickly and hastily create some sort of git mapping, where I'm fetching all employees, and I'm going to hand back a list of employee objects, find them all. I return repository dot find all. I'm taking this entity, I'm taking a list of entity objects, and I'm just turning it right over to the API. I'm handing it right back in the raw. And are there problems with this? Is this okay? What is the deal here? By the way, I'm going to put on a little bit softer. Okay, a little nice soft background music while we discuss this. These are entity objects, because this is what is the construct that's underlying the repository that we're implementing here. This is JPA. Where my employee object go? So this is JPA. This is an entity class. Now, you can carry this concept further and say, well, what if we're not talking about JPA? What if we're talking about MongoDB or Cassandra or Redis? Any situation where here's the entity that we're storing in the database. We're fetching it and we're returning it back in the web layer. We're using entity objects, whether it's technically an entity or not. The concept is still the same. This is the Java class that represents the table structure we're fetching from, and we're sending it back to the web layer. Yes, there's a fundamental problem with that. You go and code this in your application. I remember going to a training class for a particular product, 20 years ago or something, and they had some of the coolest stuff. You could actually write raw SQL queries right in your code. You didn't have to. This was not Java technology, it was something else, but you could actually write a select statement. You could do a select star operation and write it directly into a table widget object, and that was one of their big demo features that was really cool. Hey there, Manic. Thanks for subscribing to the channel. If you haven't caught it yet, The rest of y'all that are watching, hey, be sure to subscribe to the channel and check it out. So this technology I thought looked really impressive, and in their demo code, it was like a very fast way to res up stuff, where you could do a select star statement and assign it right to a widget object and put it on the screen. You know, bam, that's cool. And if you're going to build a long-term sustainable application that's going to have evolution and alterations and changes like real applications do, it's absolutely not the approach to take. So instead, invariably, when you start writing code like this, like I have here, and when you go to Stack Overflow and you pose your question, you're like, I got a problem here. Can you help me with it? Somebody inevitably comes and says, hey, wait a second, you're returning entity objects into the web layer. Shouldn't you be using a DTO? And sometimes somebody will look at that and say, what's a DTO? DTOs are data transfer objects. It's just, in the land of computer science, we sure love coming up with fancy names and definitions for stuff. And sometimes we need to nail down precision, but sometimes we get hung up in our own methodology. But essentially, a DTO is a class that you define, and the idea is to facilitate passing stuff over the web, if you will. If I go back to this controller class that we've got, the class type in this method that I'm returning, the employee is a data transfer object. I'm trying to take data from the database and I'm trying to transfer it over the web layer. So that's what the point of that is. Now, when you're using Spring Boot, Spring Boot's really slick and cool, because what it does is, by putting Spring Boot Starter Web into your build file, it puts Jackson on the class path. And Jackson is really wicked cool at being able to serialize and deserialize data between Java classes and JSON. You can also use Jackson to do XML, but who's doing XML today? Anybody? Okay. Jackson's our JSON serialization, deserialization library by default. That's what we're using. So we're serializing objects. So what we're transferring data over. And when we use the same class for that, we can run into issues. What kind of issues? That's what I'm here to discuss about. So we can understand what exactly is the trade-off that we're engaging in. What's the thing so we can make a proper decision. Some of you may know, some of you may not know, one of the main projects that I work on the Spring team is called Spring Data REST. And Spring Data REST was started off as an experiment several years ago, which was like, if we have these data repositories using Spring's repository solution, and it has these domain types, we know a lot of the metadata just from looking at that. How far can we go towards pre-baking a fully REST out hypermedia API? Just knowing this amount of data. And the answer is you can actually get quite far. There's a lot of data a lot of analysis you can do against that. And so on one level, it's a very convenient way to put together a very detailed API it's flexible, uses hypermedia structures. I don't have time to go into what the benefits of hypermedia are in tonight's live stream session, but it's really cool in the fact that you can do this sort of stuff. But if you boil it down on one level, you can look at it as, if you're using Spring Data REST, you're kind of exporting your tables to the public. You're basically taking what's in the database and you're exporting it and making it publicly visible for gets and puts and all these kinds of things to do CRUD functionality. And people that use it inevitably run into the situation where they're like, okay, I like what you provide out of the box, but I need to customize it. I want to add a few extra elements, or I need to maybe an example I use is I may have started with this employee object, and when it was a very simple prototype concept, the field had a single name attribute. There was no first name versus last name. It was just name. And later I want to evolve this API to where I want to make it be first name and last name. How do I do that without breaking everybody? And the answer is don't delete fields. Don't get rid of fields. Instead, add new fields and let the old fields still operate to make it flexible. And what you start getting into is you start altering the entity classes that you have. You have this Pojo object that represents the table you're talking to. And to make Spring Data REST work with that, you need to start evolving your domain object so that it can handle both the new format and the old format of the data. And now your fingers are getting into the database construct, into the tables, and saying, how can I do this most effectively? And that's one way to approach the whole thing. But let's take Spring Data Rest out of the equation. Let's just go back to the application we have here. There's no Spring Data Rest here. This is just, we have a Pojo object, we've got an API controller, we've got a home controller rendering a template. In this case, let's just imagine we're returning this data, but we want to make alterations. There's a philosophical point where you shouldn't, just because you change something on the data access layer doesn't mean you need to go change it in the web layer, and vice versa. The requirements in the web layer shouldn't necessarily immediately result in a change in the database. So in a sense, there's a reason to have two different classes to represent what you're doing. One is I need a web layer version representation of an employee object, and I need a database layer one. And so I need to write some code that translates between the two of them. Now you can start to debate different philosophies. There's different architectural strategies to approaching this. Do my DTO objects, do they need to know about the innards of a entity object so they can, one can be created based on the other? Should entity objects know about DTO objects? The secret answer is probably not. The stuff that's this low down in your architecture, how'd I get it on camera? Very low down in the architecture that's talking to the database probably doesn't need to do what's up the web layer. So entity objects probably should not have any knowledge of DTO objects, but for DTO objects to know what an entity object is, could make perfect sense. Or maybe that this is something affected in the service layer. A lot of people will come and tell you that this is the reason to have a service layer. You need, you know, that's where all your business logic should be living. It should be in a service layer, and it's a defined way to decouple the database from the web, is where your business stuff is in the middle. And this is the reason to have DTOs. Let's do a little bit of coding. Let's take this example where we've got an employee entity, and let's create a counterpart employee DTO object, okay? So I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call it employee DTO. Oh, excuse me. And I'm going to give it a private final employee object. In fact, let's initialize it structure, okay? That's not what I meant. So I'm going to just say, let's see, this dot employee equals employee. I could say, give me some getters, but I don't have any, and I don't want to just return back the entity object. Not unless I'm given a good reason to. But I may need some stuff like public string get ID. Let's say not wrong type. Let's go fix the type on that. Okay, let's change that to a long. How about a let's create a first name field. Let's do get last name. Okay, let's do that. And what do we have left? Role? That's right. Okay, let's get role. Okay. So we've got this. Okay. This immediately gives us the power to go back to that API controller. Say, you know, I'm going to return back the list of employee DTO objects. Can't do that. I need to actually map over that. This is where Java 8 streams are really handy. Employee, how about a new employee DTO object? And let's collect that as a list. let's see. We got, okay, that works. My ID is hinting that I can replace that with the lambda function, and it's correct. So, this is like first level decoupling. Let's move away from returning entity objects and remove the burden that the web layer could put on top of that. Hey, it's looking like we're getting some more subscribers. Thanks a bunch. Glad to see y'all here. Fist bump to y'all. So now we have this way. We're going to find all this stuff. And at first glance, this doesn't look that impressive, okay? Let's be honest here. We wrapped an employee object and we're just returning all its data. So this doesn't look fanciful, and in Java's sometimes exacerbating nature being verbose, it doesn't look elegant. Now maybe if we're using Kotlin, there's some more strategic ways to do delegation here, or if you happen to be using Groovy language, they definitely have delegate pattern. And so this is where Java gets some of its side punches from people from the outside the Java community, and I get their point. But it also kind of puts a contract in place that all these public attributes that we're rendering here. If I go run the application, we can actually see it in action. We go fire it up. With Spring Boot, it should be a piece of cake. Okay, it's thinking carefully about it. Okay, fire it up. Okay, is it up? Is it up? Something is not up. Okay, what do we got here? Error creating API controller, unsatisfied dependency through constructor parameter being employee repository. We may need to clear out some stuff. Validation. Oh, okay. I think our repository's got some old stuff in here that needs to be chucked. Okay, so I am going to throw out all these finders and this thing. Instead, I'm going to let these, I don't even... Okay, let's make sure that that builds properly. Okay, build project. Right? Aha, somebody indeed was using it. Okay, I am going to go prune out a lot of these special API calls. All right. Let's make it a very simple controller. Let's see if we can run it again here. By the way, while this fires up, I want to remind everybody that let me put the link out in the chat that for a short time offer. Wait a minute, let me put this over. Okay. If you glance here, you can see through this camera here, I've got these two covers. It's actually these two books you can get for a limited time. Put the camera on loop here. For a limited time, you can get both of these books at basically half price. If you use code STREAM4 on leanpub.com, I'm actually going to paste these coupons here so you can see them. I'm going to paste the first coupon into the chat. And let me get the other coupon. So I love it when people come to my live streams. I like to say, here you go, special deal just for you. People, you know, if you're enjoying this on the replay, you still have a chance. This coupon is good for about these coupons are good for about 48 hours. But after that, they're gone. So anyway, we've got our app up. Now we can go ping it. And remember, if we go to curl on employee, I like that. Let's format it nice, make it look good. Let's zoom in here. We can see we've got our Frodo Baggins, Bilbo Baggins, Samwise Gamgee records. And that was through our preloaded data here that we did over here. But you notice in this instance, we instead used these DTO objects instead of using the entity class object. So we expended, you could say we spent a little extra effort to create this class definition, and did it yield us much benefit? Immediately? No, it did not. It did not immediately lend us something. The idea, the benefit comes when down the road changes have to happen. Like maybe we add a new field gets added to the database. It gets added to the Pojo object that's used internally, but it doesn't need to be shown on the API. And in that case, nothing has to change on this front because the DTO is the view that the web page has, whereas the entity class is the view that the database has. And that's a point where an evolution in one side does not mandate evolution in the other side. But the flip side of that is the web page can evolve. So we can go to our DTO object here and start creating new, what I call like a virtual attribute. Just get name. Return this employee dot get first name. Well, you could actually, here you have a chance you could just build it out of the immediate attributes. Plus get last name. And if I go restart the app, just stop and rerun it, you can immediately make evolutions in the web layer. And this is a generally good practice if you're going to go and build what I would call a real app, not a demo app that you're going and demonstrating to the CTO of a business you're trying to score a contract with. You're building a real operational production grade application. This is a good tactic to adopt. The web layer should speak one type of Pojo object, whereas the database should speak a different language of Pojo object. This thing, our app is restarted, so we can go back. We can go run the same query, only now we have this new field called name, and it gives us a compound name. And so that could be a new requirement that came in, that they want this extra bit of data fashioned this way. And there, you did it without having to touch the database. Yes, you could have done it. You could have done that alteration in the entity class itself if you're using those. But then you now need to go assess what impact does that have against anybody else that's having to interact with that. There could be considerable impact. There could be other services. It could definitely indicate that you need to make sure you recheck and update any and all unit and integration tests that touch the database layer, because there could be impact. You may have broken something. Something I see with some frequency is that go back to the employee object. There we go. If you scroll down far enough, you're going to find this little thing down here called a toString method. This is very simple. I use the IDE to auto-generate it. It's a convenience thing to go dump it out on screen. Well, believe it or not, this is a public method. This is part of your entity class's public API. If you add one more field and you update this, as you probably should, you're altering the public footprint of your entity class, and you could break people. People could be dependent. People could be parsing the string output of this and expecting a certain format, for better or for worse. And if you alter it, you could break them. So you need to test against this. This should be part of your public persona that you're testing against to make sure that you know what's happening, what's not happening. And so, but the fact that this change was done not at the database layer, I don't have to test anything. I didn't change anything. The tests that I should have tests wrapped around this DTO object. If I am running a proper testing regime, I should be checking against this. And that's where it should be captured, because the requirement came in to add this field. Therefore, there should be a test exposing this, and you should code it. So I very much say we should be using DTO objects. But hold on there. Do we always, every time, always need to have these DTO objects? Because you know what? If you go back and visit YouTube, and if you go look for any talks that I've gotten at Springwind conferences, which, by the way, if you go check out springone.io, it's not too late to sign up for this year's virtual Springwind conference. So go check it out. And in fact, I've recently been notified, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to disclose this yet, but I've been notified that at least my submitted talk for Introduction to Spring Data has been accepted. So this is a talk I've actually done several times. It's very interesting because the coupon code on here is wrong. For today's thing, you need to use Stream 4. Stream 4 is your coupon code. Hey, Sassy Kubar, thanks for being here, man. Glad to share the knowledge. I like to get out with my spring peeps and get the word out. In the past, I've given a talk about Introduction to Spring Data. Why? It draws a big crowd. There's always more people that come to a spring conference. Maybe people that are coming this year couldn't make it last year. People that came last year couldn't make it to the one 4 years ago. There's always an audience for people wanting to find out about, basically, give me a quick overview of what Spring Data looks like. And so I really enjoy doing a live coding talk to that. And in every one of these presentations I've done where I code a repository, similar to what I did in the live stream a couple weeks ago, I put together, I'll use perhaps this employee object, maybe a different domain object. I'll put it in a repository, and I'll put it in an API controller. There's no DTO objects to be found. So I'm giving demos at Springwind conferences, and I'm not using DTOs. Is that right or wrong? Well, for a 30-minute conference talk, it's perfectly fine to not use DTOs. We're not trying to architect a proper application. DTOs are structures you need to put in place for real applications that you're going to be using, that you're going to be sustaining and managing over the long haul. It's a great structure for that. But when you're trying to introduce somebody to the concept of Spring Data repositories, Finder methods, how to write fundamental queries and to query the database, the focal point isn't on web applications. The focal point is not building APIs so much, or in that context. So to go in and talk about the need for DTOs, it's out of scope. And so this is where we always fall back to the cliche, well, it depends. Do you need DTOs? It depends. So whenever we see the nice chats on Stack Overflow or in YouTube comments or in other places, and people are like, you must use DTOs, or no, you don't. I'm like, it depends on what you're doing. Are you doing real applications? Are you trying to build something that needs to be sustainable, it needs to be manageable? Then probably you should. But if you're giving a demo, if you're trying to just get the feel for the technology, or you're trying to get the hang of Spring MVC methods, mapping web calls to Spring methods, even then maybe DTO objects aren't critical. In fact, in my, in the book, in my book here, I have a whole chapter on hypermedia. So as the committer to Spring Helios, where I teach you how to bring flexible and future-proof APIs using hypermedia, I show how to use the tools at hand. Spring Helios makes it very simple to make evolvable APIs that you can sustain so you don't have brittle stuff that breaks. And in those things, I'm not showing you using DTOs because it's an example. It's a demonstration. It's to show that facet of technology. The code examples in my books are demo apps. So maybe there's a hindrance and people assume that if I take the code from your book, I can go put it into production. And that's when you may get burned, when you run into the situation where I need to make a change to the API and it's going to cause me to break the database. Well, there's an architect at a company I used to work for that really had keen insight, and I learned a lot of tactics from him. And one of his biggest messages that sank into me is that you cannot use doghouse building tactics to construct a skyscraper. We need to understand how to pick up a hammer and a nail and nail two boards together. That's something you have to learn first. And some of the concepts that you learned in building simple structures are applicable when you start building bigger structures, but not all of them. And part of the trick with software development and becoming a professional software engineer and learning all these tactics is, when do the rules apply? In what context do the rules apply here, and in what context do these rules not apply? And that's part of what it takes to learn how to be a software developer. I remember working with somebody that actually struggled with being able to see the difference in that, and that was kind of shocking to me. We got a question here. Steph Smith is asking, how can you map multiple DTOs in another DTO? How can you map multiple DTO in another DTO? So I am not sure if I totally get your message, what your question is, Steph. If you want to expand upon that a little bit. I don't know if what you're saying is perhaps I have the web is returning this. This is what the web's returning, but part of the structure comes from this table and part of it comes from this table. So I'm trying to pull in 2 bits of data. Maybe if I created something, I have an employee, if I really expand the concept, I can have a concept of an entity. If I can have an employee, I certainly can have a manager, right? So I have an employee, I have a manager, and maybe for this employee DTO, I actually need both aspects to get the whole picture out. So okay, now let's... Okay, stop. Okay, my ID is overthinking this. Okay. So maybe I need 2. Let me go back here. So I talked about, maybe I need a manager, the details from a manager. Let's see, what's that? Like a long ID. And I could have like their name. Usually they have a list of managed employees. You get the idea for that. And in the sense of my DTO, I'm pulling in 2 bits of data. Okay, Steph, I think we're on the path of what we're talking about here. So in my DTO, I need to pull in 2 bits of data. Manager name. So I'm going to return this dot. Oh, this is what happens when you throw together an example incomplete. So let me just make some quick and fast getters and setters. Hey, what are IDs for? Okay. So I get that. So essentially here I've grown the scope. I need to pull in some more data to this DTO object, because in this context we need to know that. Here's where you have to be very careful. Let's see, that is this is what we're trying to do. This is not a JPA lesson, so I don't want to get bogged down in this talk about how to go write a proper one-to-many query in JPA. That's out of the scope of what we're shooting for. So I'm just going to say we understand the concept is we have an entity relationship diagram, persisting under the data, and the whole thing is this is applicable to whether we're talking about MongoDB, Redis, JPA. It's any data store. It could be a hierarchical database. You could be talking to LDAP. You could be talking to microservices. The concept is, at this layer, we're fetching data, we're fetching some type of information at this layer, and the changes at this layer should not ripple into the web layer and cause breaking changes or risk of that nature. And that's where DTOs come in and protect us. It's tricky to take a concept and necessarily turn it into a tool. Like, is there a tool that's going to ensure that we do this correctly every time? That's a tall order. There's packages like ArchUnit, which let you let you codify architectural rules, like nothing in the repository layer can invoke anything from the web layer. That's a concept that the web layer points down. Ben's saying that they use MapStruct at work. I assume that's what that is, at work. I've definitely heard of MapStruct used as a. What we run into is we want tools to facilitate writing these DTOs. If I have to use the verbose nature of Java, then I'm gonna get probably really riled up with Java at some time. I know a lot of people that will reach for Project Lombok. Lombok's controversial. I've enjoyed using Lombok. It's cool. It's cool to me because it, with a few annotations, it kind of sidesteps having to write out the Java. But that's not the only game in town. There's other ways to do that. And you know, MapStruct's on the table. But it is, you know, we have something here that's kind of complex to manage, or can turn complex to manage. And what I'm presenting here could be the simple use case. So I may be coming up, and this is a live stream session where we're talking on YouTube about it. This is not hours and weeks and months of effort that's culminated in a conflict that we have to resolve. So I don't have all the requirements. So I could be coming up with a relatively trivial example. Hopefully we can boil down 80 or 90% of the situations to these simple, trivial examples. And so it works just fine, but there may be a situation where it's not so simple. I think I remember it at my previous job, we had a really crazy table structure where we had to manage equipment. The equipment was made of chassis devices, which were modeled in one table. Some of the chassis had cards, and below that were ports, and we had to know the ports. So some devices had ports directly, some had cards that had ports, and this whole relationship was really crazy. And the number of queries we had to write to handle that was just absolutely ridiculous. But that was the real world, so we had to map it properly. And the number of times I spent chatting with our database administrator that was allocated to the software development team on this topic alone was crazy. But this is it. So these are some of the tactics we need to be aware of, and I'm starting to ramble on here, but that's the concept, is we need to learn when to use these tactics and when they're relatively unnecessary. So if you're the next time you're given a presentation, maybe it's a brown bag presentation at lunch, you're like, hey, I found out about the Spring Boot stuff, I want to share it at lunchtime. I want you to be able to have the knowledge, have the understanding, what's the trade-off between doing DTOs and not doing DTOs. So if someone's going to debate you at the point, you at least can present that. You can say, hey, look, this is just a lunchtime presentation, so we're not going to fiddle with DTOs. Now, I want you to go, if you check the live stream, I want you to check it out. There's codes to get, you can go grab a copy of each of these, actually, in ebook format, 50% off. My Hacking with Spring Boot book. By the way, if you're enjoying the show, be sure to hit the subscribe button and give it a big thumbs up. See, on a little bit of a little alternative music here. You hear that? So I want to thank everybody for turning out here for essentially, maybe you could call it a rant. I don't know. I sometimes have fun ranting and discussing, though. I just wanted to give you the information to understand what is a DTO, what's not a DTO, why do you use them, maybe why do you not use them. There's valid reasons for both. So check it out. And by the way, if you like this podcast, or if you like this YouTube channel and you're having fun doing it, go check out some of my other videos. I've got live streams, I've got other videos, give it a glance, and hey, share it with one of your friends, okay? Fist bump. Have a good evening. Cheers.